Hello. So I hope the audio is okay in this video. As with all of my political, i.e. contentious videos, I say political, but this video can go under several categories. But a disclaimer I make in all of these is that whatever your views, whether you agree or disagree with me, all I ask is you hear the whole video. Because I do try to be as objective as possible in the videos, although where I do have strong views, I don't shy away from stating those. This Osborne has been praised for not stressing human rights in a meeting with his Chinese counterparts. He's on a state visit. Don't know if you call it a state visit, but he's on a visit to Xinjiang. I won't read out the whole article, but I'll put a link under this. For those who don't know, George Osborne is Britain's finance minister. We say Chancellor of Exchequer, finance minister. That's basically second highest ranking member of the British government. Um, and basically, the report goes on to say that the Global Times, which is a state-run newspaper, praises George Osborne for his practical steps. The exact words they use are as follows. I'm not reading out the whole report just to save time, but basically it says it praises his pragmatism in regarding his China policy. It should be diplomatic etiquette for foreign leaders not to confront China by raising the human rights issue. Keeping a modest manner is the correct attitude for a foreign minister visiting China to seek business opportunities. Some Westerners believe their officials should behave like a master of human rights to show their superiority over China and the East. This is also coming in light of a report about, I should say, the lawyer Gao Zhisheng. He's a human rights lawyer and he's broken 5 years of silence to describe how the authorities have tortured him using electric batons. And he was speaking to AP, his first interview in 5 years. He's a lawyer who has defended Falun Gong defendants and Chinese Christians. Um, so, that's what he is saying. And basically, I see no reason to disbelieve him. Because those who have seen him have described physical evidence of these beatings. He says, every time we emerge from prison alive, it is a defeat for our opponents. So, I want to tackle a few points here. First of all, I think it is very important to differentiate between those who have a political job to do, like George Osborne, and human rights activists. Amnesty International has criticised Osborne for not raising these issues. I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a second. I think AI, whilst I have a huge amount of respect for their work, I think they're being a little bit short-sighted in terms of understanding the position that George Osborne is in. What he has said is that we do raise human rights concerns privately. We have two very different political systems, but we do raise human rights concerns privately. Um, it's not a contradiction though to discuss these things whilst also intermittently trying to do business with a fifth of the world's population. I do think it's very important for those in organisations like Amnesty International and so on to understand the position that someone that Mr. Osborne is in. If they expect him to go into Beijing just openly sort of denounce his Chinese hosts, I think that's a bit naive. I mean, I understand that's their job, but they need to understand that he is in a position of trying to secure trade. And it would be all very well to just say, oh, we should have no trade with a country that has a dismal human rights record, as China does. But that's just not realistic. China's the world's second biggest economy. And whilst this is obviously state-owned media, technically what Global Times is saying is right. It wouldn't be practical for Osborne to do that. Nevertheless, that article or that statement reeks of arrogance. like talking about the correct way for foreign diplomats to behave. Um, a few things I would say about this. China's only been an open country for 37 years, since 1978. So I think there's still this kind of complex identity that China has. That is to say, it's a very powerful country, and it's getting growing influence in the world, and yet there's still this very defensive, almost paranoid attitude whenever anyone on the outside raises these issues. What Beijing needs to understand is that for Western countries, human rights isn't just about, they see this as wielding superiority. Well, today I would argue China is a more powerful country than Britain. So it's hardly a case of Britain pushing China around, because we're not in a position to, quite frankly. So, that doesn't actually make sense. Why would we practically try to push around a bigger country? It doesn't make sense. So that's basically, to me, that's pure propaganda. It's just to try and once again use this as an excuse to be defensive and to say that we are above criticism. Now, to me, that's arrogant. Um, no country in the world is above criticism. For some reason, the Chinese government believe they are the only government in the world that shouldn't be criticized. Um, if we use a comparable country, i.e., the United States, because it's the only country that's really comparable in terms of economic size and so on, it's bigger, but it's number one, China's number two. Um, Look at the amount of criticism the United States faces all the time, you know, but you don't hear Chinese politicians for the most part. Okay, maybe some Republicans, but generally speaking, you don't hear, for example, the Obama administration say, "Oh, you cannot criticize us. This is internal affairs." So there's a fundamental difference of thinking. That is to say, in my view, Western countries are a lot more open. Certainly, you will have nationalism, you'll have defensiveness, you'll have jingoism, you'll have all the same trends, but fundamentally, Western countries are a lot more open. So China playing the victimhood mentality, frankly, I think that argument wears a little bit thin. Number one, China's a powerful country. It's not a victim. It's a very powerful country. And number two, they need to understand that it's a bit like if you go into personal business, forget countries for a minute. Let's say you go into personal business. Now, let's say I'm a businessman, right? And I want to do a merger with another businessman. I would want to know a little bit about his background. It's not just about the business agreement, like we both agree with the company assets or whatever it is. I would want to know a bit about his personality. I'd want to know a bit about his background. Now, let's say, for example, that businessman had been convicted of GBH 5 years ago or whatever, um, but he's a great businessman. Am I going to be concerned? Yes, I am going to be a little bit concerned. So I would make the same analogy with countries. It's it's just not accurate to say, or just not consist. I'll try and find the right word to describe what I'm talking about. It's not it's not fair to say that oh, we're happy to do deals with the British, but they should shut up about everything else or other Western countries. Um, that's just not. If you're doing a deal with someone, it's fair that George Osborne and London expect some transparency. To me, that's complete fairness. And the Chinese side, for their part, have they improved? Maybe they have since the 70s, but in many areas they're still extremely defensive. Now, this issue about human rights, I understand how Beijing thinks. They're thinking, why on earth do these people care? This is our people, it's our business. But they need to understand that for us, this isn't just about internal Chinese affairs, and it is not about wielding superiority. I don't know what George Osborne thinks, but what they need to understand, it isn't just the British government. Many private citizens are concerned about this, including me. I'm not a politician, you know. I'm not a member of any human rights organization. I'm just a regular guy who happens to be very concerned about this because I'm realistic. I know that we cannot simply shun trade with the world's second biggest economy. I think that would be stupid. So George Osborne is right that this needs to be prioritized. But The Chinese side. I mean, take this for example. Let's say we had, let's cite the urban riots in England in 2011, when inner cities were rioting and so on. Now, if the Chinese were to turn around and say we are concerned about that, I would say you've every right to be if you want to do trade with us. So I disagree fundamentally with the Chinese argument that internal affairs are completely irrelevant. It's not. It's part of getting to know someone. It's part of trust. It's a part of a lot of other questions. And from the British perspective, we are uncomfortable. At least many individuals are uncomfortable with doing such close trade with a country that has an attitude to human rights that it has, and which tortures dissidents. I mean, put it this way: if they don't do that, they're not showing any evidence to the contrary. Because whenever these issues are raised, it's always the same old excuses like, oh, they're CIA agents or they're just troublemakers or something like that. I personally believe that the Chinese Communist Party has a huge track record of serious human rights abuses, and the list goes on and on and on. The Xi administration may have ended forced labor and re-education camps, but human rights abuses continue in other ways. Dissent is still crushed. Yes, there is a scope online for debate, but it is still restricted. And there's still every single media forum is state approved. Um, so yeah, I think there are some very legitimate questions. As for Falun Gong, I know this is a very controversial issue in China, and I've been in some debates with people about this. Number one, I'm not a member of Falun Gong, so I have absolutely no reason to promote their religious agenda, whatever that is. But I would make this simple point. Even if they are a dangerous cult, as the state claims, even if that is the case, and I'm not saying that they are entirely harmless, I'm not saying that, but we have an expression in English and it is two wrongs don't make a right. Therefore, if they really are as dangerous as the state is making them out to be, that still doesn't condone torture. And there is abundant pieces of information online that indicates that Falun Gong members have been tortured by the Chinese government. If that is accurate, if that is accurate, it's utterly shameful. There was one case in, I forget which province, but a young woman was brutally tortured in one of these so-called black jails. These are serious, serious questions that need to be addressed. And I just don't accept that everyone who claims that the Chinese government has inflicted torture on them, they're all liars. When it comes down to a choice between a human rights lawyer and the Chinese government, I know which side is more likely to be telling the truth. Why? Because the Chinese government has a very long track record of dishonesty. They're dishonest about Mao's crimes, they're dishonest about their own past. To this day, they will not acknowledge the crimes of the Cultural Revolution. It's all mistakes made by Chairman Mao. So fundamentally, and this is true of every country that has a single party regime, when you have a lack of democracy, you have a lack of transparency. The two go hand in hand. And that's understandable because the Communist Party wants to keep an iron grip on power. So why would they talk about their crimes? Why would they be honest about that? It makes total sense. I can afford to say these things because I'm a private individual. If I was in George Osborne's shoes, obviously I would have to be a lot more diplomatic. But I more or less support the approach that he's taking because I think it's the only approach he can take. It wouldn't be practical to humiliate his hosts publicly. That would be rude, right? But if it's true what he's saying, if he's telling the truth and he is raising these concerns privately, I support that 100%. Why? Because he is an elected official and the British people expect him to. He wouldn't be doing his job if he was completely silent on these issues. Now, the Cameron administration has been very, very close or made it clear that they want to be very close to Beijing. Again, this is understandable. China is the world's second biggest economy, so making moves to get close to China is very understandable. In fact, the Cameron administration has said they want to be the Western country that is closest to China. I have mixed views on that. On one hand, from a sentimental perspective, I love China. I've many, many Chinese friends, so I personally feel a connection with China. So from that point of view, from a sentimental perspective, I'm okay with that. But what I don't want is a situation where we're basically selling our soul. And we're basically, if it comes down to a situation of just all these trade agreements and human rights and other concerns are never raised, then that would be one sided. It would be basically pandering to Beijing's demands. This is not the first time in Chinese history this has happened. Back in the 18th century, when diplomats from King George III's court went to open up trade, and by the way, this was before the Opium Wars, went to open up trade. The emperor at the time, I forget which emperor specifically, but this was under the Qing dynasty, basically rebuffed them and spoke about the superiority of the Middle Kingdom. So I think it's a bit hypocritical for the Chinese side to talk about victimhood and superiority over the East. This all comes down to the humiliation that the Qing dynasty suffered in its final years. But the truth is, for much of its history, the arrogance has come from the Chinese side. I mean, in various dynasties, they saw the rest of the world as inferior. They saw Westerners as inferior. So I think it's very hypocritical to play the victimhood card and talk about how the West looks down on them. This is not about looking down on China. In fact, in many ways, we look up to China. We see it as a powerful country, and we certainly wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of China, you know? So I think that I feel very frustrated sometimes with the arrogance that comes from Beijing because it's constantly about we make these demands, you have to do what we say, and if you dare question us, then it's almost like blackmail. Question us, we won't do trade with you. I agree, you do need a level of diplomacy, and of course there should be politeness, but I don't believe that raising human rights concerns is rude. I believe it's simply being honest. And from the British perspective, honesty is very important. Would it not be better, would it not be more polite to be completely candid rather than hiding feelings? Maybe the Chinese thinking is different. I do think that fundamentally, and this is a controversial thing that I'm going to say, but I think fundamentally, dishonesty is deeply, deeply ingrained in Chinese society. And before people jump to conclusion with what I'm saying there, I'm not saying individual Chinese people are dishonest. Individual Chinese people that I've known have been thoroughly decent and honest people. I'm not saying that, but I do believe that dishonesty is a very big problem in China. The reason so many vendors rip off Westerners isn't just because they believe that Westerners are rich. Their attitude, and this is somewhat justified, is well, if the government's dishonest, then why shouldn't we be? There was a poll recently done of the main concerns of Chinese adults. Number one was corrupt officials. That proves that this isn't just Western concerns. Many Chinese people themselves have these concerns. In other words, most Chinese adults simply don't trust the government. So yes, individual Chinese people may get a bit defensive and a bit nationalistic when outsiders bring these issues up. And the average Chinese citizen probably isn't as concerned about human rights as outsiders are, but they do clearly see the government as insincere. Like I say, the Xi administration has worked hard to crack down on corruption. That's something that I would welcome because it has been a big problem in China. That's a good thing and it's necessary. There has been concerns that this is part of a power drive, something akin to what happened in the 70s with the Gang of Four and all that. I don't know enough to say whether that is or isn't. I mean, tackling corruption in itself is not a bad thing. It is necessary. Another area where I would praise the Chinese government, they have successfully brought a lot of people out of poverty. They've been much more successful in India, for example, in this regard. So again, I would commend them for that. So I'm not 100% critical and negative about the Chinese government, but when it comes to human rights, they have a very long way to go. And we should not be feeling awkward every time we bring this issue up. We should have the confidence to just be honest about this because it comes down to trust. And this is what the Chinese side need to understand. A final point, when you have a single party controlling everything, you're not going to have transparency. So, to any Chinese people watching this, you might be annoyed at what I'm saying. You might say, I don't know anything about China, but this is something I've been studying for years. I haven't just read this 5 minutes ago. I've been looking at these issues from both sides. I've looked at the Chinese state side as well. I've looked at both sides, and I stand by everything that I'm saying because I believe there's a long way to go. Now, I know one of the main arguments is you can't compare the two societies. China is the world's most populous country, so there is unique challenges. I agree with that. I also agree that these things cannot be rushed overnight. But what I fundamentally disagree with is this arrogant attitude that China and China alone is above critique. Why? Because Western countries are criticized all the time. The notion seems to be, oh, poor China is being picked on. But Britain, America, France, other Western countries are constantly scrutinized, constantly. But much, much less do you see the same sort of these are internal affairs, mind your own business attitudes. You might see it from American Republicans, you might see it from some reactionary nationalists, but generally speaking, I would argue that Western countries are a lot more transparent. Um, if anyone's offended by this video, I'm sorry. That's not my intention. It's really, really not. But I do feel frustrated with some of these issues. Um, Inevitably, we have to deal with China. It's the world's second biggest economy, and yes, a certain amount of diplomacy comes into that. But I hope George Osborne is being honest when he says that he does discuss these issues privately. Because what the Chinese side needs to understand is that it is part of trust, understanding, and having some sort of knowledge about what is going on internally. That's part of trust.